Well, one thing is for certain, in Canada, we have gotten a lesson or two when it comes to what our rights and freedoms actually are in this country. But do we really have a grip on it? Today, I'm sitting beside the litigation director at the Democracy Fund. The Democracy Fund has championed civil liberties during times with COVID and beyond. And we're going to hear from Alan Honner about what you need to know about just that.
What do we have to complain about? We have human rights at the provincial and federal level. We have privacy rights, and we have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms that guarantees us fundamental freedoms, due process, and equality. We've even signed off on international conventions which protect civil and political rights. But in practice, we find that the protections offered by law are not as robust as they seem. In the past few years, we have discovered that discrimination against the unvaccinated is not merely tolerated, but is encouraged by major institutions such as government, media, and universities.
All right, Alan, now you are, like myself, you were one of the speakers and panelists at a really big conference in Victoria. That's actually where we're filming from right now. And you can click the description box below to get more info. It's called the Reclaiming Canada Conference. Took place in Victoria this past weekend. Today, I'm going to pick your brain on something very important here, and that is I call it how to do activism right, because we're seeing certain things like laws against protesting drag queen story times happening. We're seeing during COVID, we saw things like people being told they can't protest near medical clinics, all of these things. So what is, I guess, something you want to start with when you talk to people who want to do activism, they want to stand for our rights, but maybe we don't want the hammer down on us.
Right. Well, Drea, I think one thing we have to keep in mind when we're thinking about activism is that in Canada, our rights are not absolute. And if you read the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the first section, before they even talk about fundamental freedoms or due process rights or rights of equality, that first section talks about how our rights are guaranteed subject only to reasonable limits. Mm-hmm. Those reasonable limits have to be prescribed by law, as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. Now, of course, the biggest limitation to our rights, our civil rights, is built right into the Charter of Rights and Freedoms itself. Before that document discusses anything about freedom of religion or freedom of expression or any other right, it makes a point of saying that those rights are not fully guaranteed. They are subject to reasonable limits. And so that is the situation we actually live in. And what I think sometimes people who are involved in activism might not understand is that they can make our situation worse. They can make our country a little bit less free if they engage in a certain type of activism which will prompt the government, whether it be a municipal government, a provincial government, or a federal government, to make a law which restricts something like the right to protest. Given the situation we're in, a situation in which our rights are seriously qualified, we have to exercise the right of dissent with a certain measure of responsibility. Because if we are not careful, we will exercise the right of dissent to our own detriment and to the detriment of future generations.
Yeah, like I said, we've seen lots of that. And I think you're absolutely right there. The Democracy Fund has taken on many cases, in case you're not sure, about the little guy, protecting the little guy against the big system. And you guys have great lawyers. You contract great lawyers to help people with those, often at no cost, or always, I guess, at no cost, thanks to donations at the Democracy Fund. But I have seen over the past few years so many people, with their hearts in the right place who want to be a lawyer themselves, it seems. seems. They think that they can just go there and represent themselves and take down the system. Sometimes they say they're a free man on the land and all of those stuff. What advice can you give us in that area where people say, you don't really need a lawyer to fight the fight we're fighting?
Well, no lawyer is going to tell you that you don't need a lawyer because,
they want to get paid. Just joking.
Well, because it's a risky thing to tell somebody to defend themselves when they might not know the intricacies of the law, right? Now, it sometimes happens that a bad lawyer can actually make things worse. Mm-hmm. And so, some people actually might be better off with a lawyer. But so I guess the sounder advice would be that you'd always be better off with a good lawyer.
A good lawyer, yeah.
But if you are going to defend yourself, or if you're going to engage in activism, it's a good idea to know, at least broadly, what the law is like in Canada. And if we can just go back to that example we talked about before, when an activist can actually do harm. If the government is wanting to make a law, a bylaw or statutory law, whatever it is, and that law is going to infringe upon your charter rights, one of the things they need is a pressing and substantial objective, right? And what you can do as an activism is you can sometimes deliver them that pressing and substantial objective, whereas they didn't necessarily have it before. Right. And maybe I can give you a hypothetical example. Let's suppose there was somebody who wanted to protest the involvement of transgendered people in women's sports. Mm-hmm. That person might have a point because, a woman who has been training her entire life to compete is arguably devalued if she's competing against somebody who has a different biology. Mm-hmm. So this activist might be making a good point, but if that person uses inflammatory language or language that sort of skirts the line of hate speech, then that's going to be noticed. And let's suppose there are children in place. Now, let's suppose this is a competition which doesn't involve older females, but children. Then it's going to be noticed. And if the government wants to make a law restricting protests in a limited way, perhaps outside of sporting events when there's a competition going on, they might be able to have that law upheld by the court because they have a pressing and substantial objective, and all they have to do then is to make sure that the means they're using to carry out that objective are proportionate. And all of a sudden, the government has what they see as a reason to ban protests outside of sporting facilities during competitions because they need to protect people from harmful speech against characteristics that cannot be changed and which are supported or protected by human rights legislation. That is their pressing and substantial objective, and the protester has conveniently served it up to the government.
So this takes me to activism again. You have all these people who want to help fight for change, for the way they would like to see Canada go, but they don't have a lawyer in their ear. Maybe they're watching here. What is the first steps if there's something you want to protest, sort of similar to what you're saying? There's a lot of parents who want to protest the sexually explicit books in schools right now. What's a couple of pointers to them on what would be an effective legal way to do that? Do you have any advice in that area?
Well, I don't give people advice on how to protest because I'm not an activist and I don't have any specialty in that. I think there are a lot of ways you can dissent against the system, and protesting is just one of them. Obviously you have to keep the protest legal. I think you wouldn't be able to say that you're exercising a right to dissent if you are doing something illegal. But there are just some obvious things, I guess. If you are protesting, you want to protest on public land. Mm-hmm. You don't want to protest on private land, right? But and the other thing is, and this is really the reality of protests, is that most protests break some law or another. They
block a sidewalk, they block a road. They're disruptive, they're meant to be disruptive. And in our legal system, we have this sort of tension, right? On the one hand, we have things like freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. And on the other hand, we have these laws which are actually good laws. So you don't want people to be able to shut down a highway, right? And the way this is resolved so often is by police discretion, right? Because the police have discretion to lay a charge or not, depending on whether it's in the public interest. And I think, if you engage in protest, you have to keep in mind what's going on with the police, and you don't want to push them so far that they're going to take legal action against you.
Well, very good advice from Alan Honner from the Democracy Fund. We'll go ahead and link their charity below. And let us know in the comments what you think about what he had to say. Thanks for being on Rebel News.
It's been a pleasure, Drea. Thank you.
If you appreciate this report and all of our coverage of the Reclaiming Canada conference, please consider chipping in to cover our expenses to get here. We had to take a very expensive ferry. By we, I mean myself and Alex, who's behind the camera. We also had to get an Airbnb to stay here. And all of that is expenses that we rely and hope that you will help us cover. So if you'd like to chip in a few bucks to do so, please go to rebelfieldreports.com and chip in what you can. We appreciate your support.